Welcome to Wednesday's edition of COVID-19. The daily count here in Korea has surged past 100 cases with sporadic outbreaks within daily life settings. And this reality has health authorities highlighting the importance of proper personal safety measures, proper distancing, regular disinfection and ventilation. Meanwhile, in the US, voters across the nation they went to polling stations, that is, to cast their ballots for a new leader amid the pandemic. We have more on that later on the program. Here first is our Kwon So-ah with the latest on the pandemic across the world. So let's start with Korea, where authorities have recorded more than 100 infections today.
Yes, Sunny. The numbers have been fluctuating below and above 100 in the recent weeks. And this Wednesday, we're at 118 new infections. And that raises the total to 26,925 here in the country. We also have 2 fatalities, raising the death toll to 474. And a little over 1,830 people remain in quarantine, while we have 24,616 people who were discharged from treatment or hospitals, with 106 new recoveries. Now, the daily caseload in total, we do have, in the meantime, have a drop in imported cases today at 20, which means domestic infections are close to 100. And if transmissions stay below 100 in average in the densely populated capital region, the country remains under level 1 social distancing measures. Now, the daily caseload in total, which includes imported and domestic transmissions, has risen to the 100s, as I said before, after 2 days being in the double digits.
Right. So what appears to be the reason for this latest rise in cases?
Well, Sunny, cluster infections at high-risk facilities such as medical facilities, nursing homes, but also we have new cases emerging at restaurants, pubs, small family gatherings, schools and academies, meaning they are emerging during day-to-day activities. And more concerns are lingering as health authorities say movement across the country has increased over the weekend. There is potential of virus spreads having occurred during Halloween festivities, with concerns that young people may carry the virus with little to no symptoms. A rise in the number of mountain goers during the fall season is also putting authorities on high alert as cases of improper wearing of face masks are being reported more frequently. Now, if we take a look at where the new cases this Wednesday emerged, we see still the cases are concentrated in the metropolitan region, with 43 in Gyeonggi-do province, 42 in the capital Seoul. These 2 places had cases in the 20s just a day ago. We also have 10 in Chungcheongnam-do province, and this Wednesday we also see 1 case down on Jeju-do Island. And we have 20 imported cases, out of which 11 were detected at the nation's airport or seaports. And out of these, we have 3 from the US, 3 from Poland, and also others from European and Asian countries. Now, speaking of the US, this country voted for their next president under an unprecedented situation, with around 100 million Americans having cast their ballots in early voting. And that is attributed to a rise in enthusiasm for the election, but also the fear about the pandemic. We will have more on the elections with our Kim Han-ul in a bit, but let's take a look at the figures here in the US first. The country is nearing 9.7 million cases soon, and it is leading the world in highest number of infections, accounting for 20% of infections, while the population is around 4% of the world. And resurgences in Europe, which recently hit 11 million cases in total. One of the most serious spots here, France, 1.5 million, with some 36,000 new infections reported in just a day. The UK also reported over 20,000 infections in the span of 24 hours. And if we move over to other places, we also have Poland here emerging as the country becoming the one with the 20th highest number of infections at over 400,000 and surpassing the total number of cases in Bangladesh. And in total, we have 47.3 million cases with over 425,000 new infections recorded as of noon Korea time, and almost 9,000 fatalities fatalities, and recoveries stand at around 34 million. And those are the updates I have for now. We don't have briefings in the afternoon on Wednesdays, so I'll be back here tomorrow. Back to you, Sunny.
All right, Sua, thank you for that. I'll see you tomorrow. Staying on the international front, as one pundit put it, it has been a parade of unprecedented events this year, and voter participation in the 2020 US presidential race is no exception, as the country is on track to setting a new record. Now, for more on this reality and on the voting system in the US, I have our Kim Hanul here in the studio. Welcome, Hanul.
Good afternoon.
Right, so voters are not voting for the president, but the electoral college system is doing so. Please tell us more about the system over in the US.
Sure. So unlike the presidential system, election system here in Korea, where the winner is determined by the popular vote, Americans vote for a group of representatives that makes up the electoral college. So these representatives are called electors and often comprised of elected state officials, party leaders, and activists, with each of them representing one electoral college vote. The number of electoral college votes depends on the size of the population for a given state. There are 538 in total, and a candidate must win the majority of them in order to win the presidency, which is 270 votes or more. In the majority of states, the winner is awarded all the electoral votes. That means if you win in California, the most populous state, even by one vote, you will be awarded all 55 votes. So because of this winner-takes-all system, a candidate can technically win the popular vote, but still lose in the election.
Right, which was the reality 4 years ago, right?
Right.
So why vote this way?
So the electoral college system is like a compromise solution dating back to the early foundation days of America. So there was a great concern that there were urban areas where more population was involved would actually dominate the less populated rural areas. So America's founding fathers wanted to quell the formation of powerful factions. They wanted a mechanism that did not solely rely on popular majorities or Congress. Today, electors meet in their respective states on the first Monday after the second Wednesday of December, which happens to be December 14th this year, to cast separate ballots for the president and the vice president. The candidates who receive a majority of votes are elected.
I see. And as our Kwon mentioned earlier, early voting that is, hit record highs this year. Tell us more.
Sure. So right before COVID-19, you would see voters standing in long lines in their local polling stations, but we may not see that happening this year. A record number of early votes were cast by mail before the election day, with many Americans hesitant to go out and cast their ballots in person due to the pandemic. To curb the spread of the virus and to ensure a safe voting environment, states allowed and urged voters to cast their ballots remotely. However, the two presidential hopefuls have been sharply divided over the issue, with President Trump blasting postal ballots as an opportunity for voting fraud, while Joe Biden said greater access to mail-in votes should be made available for Americans.
Right. And could mail-in voting then be the deciding factor for the results this year?
Well, there's some research that suggests that mailing voting will actually increase voter turnout and increase representation for people who have faced high barriers for voting. According to a recent study by the University of California, Berkeley, young Americans, African Americans, those with less education and with lower incomes, showed a disproportionate increase in voter participation with mail-in voting. But this does not guarantee that all of these postal ballots will be counted. A recent study by the University of Florida says voting by mail is a fundamentally different system of voting than voting in person. And there is a disproportionately high number of rejected ballots from certain groups, many of whom tend to vote Democrat. For instance, a study showed that voters aged between 18 to 21 show a higher rejection rate due to their inexperience in voting.
Meanwhile, Hannah, I understand counting the unprecedented number of mail-in votes this year is looking to be a daunting task.
That's right. We're talking about a number of challenges here. The first challenge is actually opening and counting these postal ballots. Polling workers will have to manually remove the ballots from the envelopes, and they have to verify whether they are valid before they can be fed into the tabulating machines. With the threat of the pandemic still looming, these polling workers must abide by proper prevention guidelines, and many have warned that the counting process may not be complete by the end of the election day. And the second challenge is that there could be questions and battles over the legitimacy of late arriving ballots. With so many Democrats voting by mail, it's quite possible that a blue wave of votes will roll in days after the election. President Trump is therefore counting on being ahead on election night so he could announce a victory or at least build strong momentum before a potential late surge of mail-in votes come for Joe Biden, which President Trump has threatened to challenge in court.
Okay, Hannah, thank you for that report. Hope to see you again soon.
See you then.
Right, staying in the U.S., polling stations have closed, with those in Alaska and Hawaii being among the last to do so. Vote counting, that is now underway. And for more on this, I have our Hyun-kyung in Los Angeles, live on the line. Hello, Hyun.
And good day, Sunny.
Right, Hyun, so did you vote?
Yes, I did. I did actually get out there and rock a vote. I mean, I think it's a very big thing, a very big event that's going on. I think tense is a way that you can put it, and anxious is what you're getting from a lot of these people that are out there for to rock the vote there.
Right. What was the overall atmosphere like at the voting stations?
Okay, the overall atmosphere, basically, I mean, everyone wants to be out there, and there are long lines, and people did actually turn out to vote. And as expected, a lot of conservatives, they chose to come out to the polling stations. As you see some of the late results that are coming in, or as you see some of the poll closing and the results that are coming out, and you see some of the numbers go up on the red side. I think everyone wanted to really come out there despite the concerns over contracting COVID and expectations of longer lines caused by changes to voting procedures. People turned out to vote, as you could see, and it may set a new record.
Right, and speaking of that, Hyun, what appears to have fueled the rate of voter participation in this particular presidential election?
Well, listen, the figure right now, when you're talking about like the early voting, for example, you did mention with Hunter that there was early voting going on. The figure that was set from the early votes that turned out was somewhere in the vicinity of 100 million. And now that's like 48 million of those were actually from like the battleground states. So this is double the number of early voting in 2006. Simply put, a lot of people are taking this very seriously and are exercising the most basic responsibility as Americans. I'm sure you've heard reports that it's very polarized here, and it is. There is a lot of tension. Supporters of the former VP are concerned about the pandemic, and many just plain do not like the incumbent president and how his administration has been dealing with COVID. While Trump supporters are concerned of the economy and lawlessness, a residual effect from the BLM protests, there are several other factors, but I get the sense that for many voters, it's almost personal, like exacerbated by the events of 2020.
Hyun, given the times, were safety measures amid the pandemic in place at these polling stations?
Well, of course, because everyone are required to wear masks. I know you see a lot of reports of people choosing not to wear masks in the U.S., but for the most part, when you're on the streets and you're going around, most people are complying with that the mask wearing procedures. Now, everyone are required to wear masks in the polling stations, and some polling stations actually had election officials greeting voters from tables behind plexiglass barriers to protect them and the voters. And polling lines took a bit longer to get through due to the frequent disinfection activities. And you could understand that these are measures that must be taken to protect people.
Hyun, Los Angeles is home to the largest Korean American population in the U.S. What is the atmosphere among them ahead of the election results?
Okay, Korean Americans is kind of polarized as well. A lot of the Korean Americans that are running small businesses and those that are, paying taxes and just working to make a living, struggling just to get by. A lot of them happen to show support for Trump, while others, people who are, I would say, especially citizens, people second and third generation, Korean Americans, I think they have sort of a tendency to go with Biden. But again, it's really polarized. There's a lot of arguments that I see on social media, even today, even starting from like the beginning of the year, regarding who they want as president.
I see. So each candidate has a fair share of Korean American support then?
I would say so. I would definitely say so.
Right.
So there is a strong amount of Korean American support for Donald Trump, and there's also almost an equal, I would say. I'm not exactly sure, but I would say there is a very strong support for Biden as well.
Right. Young, there have been a few concerning trends in the U.S. amid the election, including anonymous robocalls to voters urging them to stay safe and stay home, as well as a surge in gun sales and stores bracing for post-election unrest, as well as possible violence. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Well, people that belong to maybe a small merchants association or small business association, or just people who own business in general, they do have a communication network where people are telling each other, say, hey, you have to, if you're in downtown LA or if you're in these areas, you need to board up your store windows in fear of other protests or rioting or looting for that matter. So there are a lot of businesses that are taking precautions to board up the windows. And gun sales have been through the roof since March this year when the pandemic started. It's been insane. I mean, ammo and bullets, you can't find them anywhere. There's long lines in front of gun stores. I've never seen anything like this before, and it is a cause for concern.
Right. Young, one final question before we let you go. And I understand this might be a tough one, but when will the winner, do you suppose, will be announced?
Well, right now, you can kind of get a peek into what's going on. 270 is the magic number here, and whoever reaches that, they're going to be the next president of the United States. So if that number doesn't come out today, then the deadline to get the ballots in, the early voting and the mail-in ballots was, I believe, Monday. So in the next week or so, that's what analysts are expecting full results to come out, if the results do not come out today or tomorrow or in the near future.
Right. Okay, Young, as always, thank you for being with us at this late hour with your thoughts.
It's actually not that late. Thank you for having me.
I say we're learning to live with it. We have no choice.
220,000 Americans dead. Anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as President of the United States of America.
You know what, North Korea? We're not in a war. We have a good relationship.
What has he done? He's legitimized North Korea. He's talked about his good buddy, who's a thug.
In today's studio session, we talk about the U.S. presidential race, which is on course for its highest voter turnout in over 100 years. Another key issue about the election this time around is that it took place amid a raging pandemic that has been wreaking havoc, the most havoc that is, if you will, in the U.S. For more, I have Dr. Alice Hyun-kyung Tan from MizMedi Women's Hospital. Welcome back, Dr. Tan.
Thank you for having me.
And I also have Dr. Ko Myong-hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Good to have you back, Dr. Ko.
Thanks.
Dr. Tan, before we touch upon the actual election itself, we could perhaps start with your assessment of the COVID-19 situation in the U.S.
Well, I guess we could start with a little bit of good news. There are pockets of relatively good control. There are 5 states in America that are showing test positivity rates of less than 2%. Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, New York, and Hawaii. Other than that, however, the news is pretty grim. Top U.S. experts have stated that the situation in the U.S. is not looking good. For example, Dr. Deborah Birx, who is a top U.S. expert, has said that the U.S. is entering the most concerning and the most deadly phase of the pandemic. In addition, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who is the former FDA commissioner, has said that things are getting worse around the country. And these assessments are based on the data, and the data do not look good. The U.S. is ranking 13th overall in the world in terms of total confirmed cumulative COVID-19 cases per million population. But among OECD countries, it ranks 4th. In terms of the number of new cases and new hospitalizations, many states are seeing record highs in those categories. For example, South Dakota and the adjacent 4 states, so that's North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, they're seeing greater than 200 people per million population hospitalized due to COVID-19, and that's what's going on currently. 36 states out of 50, so that's the majority, they're showing test positivity rates greater than 5%, and that indicates that not enough testing is being done, and there are probably many cases that are not being diagnosed who are in the community, and of course that's leading to more spread. There are signs that the virus is spreading rapidly. The cases are accelerating. The doubling rate, it used to be around 100 in September, 100 days, and now it's 75. That's a sign that things are moving in the wrong direction. And of course, the darkest trend is the number of daily new deaths. This number, the trend, had been increasing very subtly since September. But in the recent few days, that number does seem to be climbing, and it's projected that by February 1st, the number of daily deaths in America will be 2,000 people. Right now, that number stands at around 600. So the situation does not look good.
Right. Dr. Ko, do tell us a bit about the impact then of COVID-19 on the U.S., on the actual race itself.
So I think the impact of COVID-19 has been twofold. One in the substantive area of the electoral issue itself, as well as the voting process. So in terms of substance, clearly COVID-19, as Dr. Tan mentioned, has been catastrophic for the American society and American economy. Obviously, taking place in the electoral year, it had a huge impact in determining the preference for candidates for the American public. And in a way, this year's election would have been an easy election for the incumbent, President Trump, had not been for COVID-19. And because of COVID-19, with the economic depression level of unemployment, as well as the public health crisis, essentially President Trump is fighting for his political life. So I think that in that sense, COVID-19 had acted in a very important way. And as well as the voting process itself, because of COVID-19, many states in the United States expanded the early voting as well as the mail-in voting processes. That didn't take place before. This is a brand new thing for many voters in the United States right now. And that's the reason why there are many essentially like a newly canceled voting, mail-in votes and then early voting, because voters are not used to the procedure and they're making mistakes and they're essentially nullifying the results and affecting the overall outcome. So this is actually problematic because this creates the ground for whoever is the losing end of the election to contest the outcome and prolong the process of determining who the winner is. And especially for President Trump, who has threatened not to concede in any manner, this could actually precipitate the United States, American society, into a more chaotic state than it is already. So in that sense, it also compounded the difficulties that the country is facing.
Dr. Tan, adding on to the grim numbers that you shared with us, one day ahead of the election, several battleground states, so to speak, saw their highest average in new daily COVID-19 cases. Do you see this reality as perhaps affecting the outcome of the election this time around?
I'm not a politician, so I can't make those kinds of predictions. But what I can tell you is, of the 9 states that are seeing the highest number of absolute cases of COVID-19 in hospitals, 6 are in those so-called battleground categories. So Texas, Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Also, the metrics for other battleground states do not look good. For Iowa, the test positivity is 37.4%. In Arizona, it's 11.8%. In Nevada, it's 10.2%. North Carolina, as you said, just set a new record for new cases of COVID-19 diagnosed over 24 hours. 2,885 cases were diagnosed. But it remains to be seen how and whether the impact of COVID-19 will influence how people vote. And so that's what we're all waiting to see.
Right, time will tell then. Dr. Go, the result of the US presidential race also looks to affect matters here on the Korean Peninsula. Now, having said that, what are the stances of the two presidential nominees with regard to matters affecting Korea and this peninsula?
So clearly, President Trump and then Vice President Biden have a diametrically different, I would say even opposite positions when it comes to their policy towards North Korea. President Trump is known to preferring the so-called top-down approach, which also preferred by Kim Jong-un. So essentially what top-down means is that the top leaders of the two countries will come together first and determine the most important issue here on the table, which is in this case denuclearization, and then proceed to determine the pesky details of technical details of denuclearization later on. Which didn't really work out great for either North Korea or the United States. Denuclearization negotiations are an impasse for the last 2 years. There hasn't been any progress so far. Vice President Biden has criticized this approach, and clearly Biden, if he's elected, he probably will represent a return to the previous American policy or approach of assuming more bottom-up approach. Essentially, the North Korea and the United States come together, ideally, and determine the nitty-gritty details of the technical details of denuclearization first. Once they agree upon a roadmap of denuclearization, they'll proceed to essentially advance or maybe progress on other domains, such as diplomatic domain, establishing new diplomatic relations between the two countries, or lifting sanctions will pertain to the economy of North Korea. So these are actually really two different approaches, and it's evident that the South Korean government probably prefers President Trump's approach, which more dramatic approach of leaders of the countries coming together and also trying to solve all major outstanding progress in one go, I would say. And it's very dramatic, politically convenient, and so I think, and also President actually creates a space for South Korea to play a moral middleman. So in essence, I think depending on who is elected today or this week, will determine a fundamental change in U.S. policy towards North Korea.
Right. Now, for more insight into what lies ahead regarding security and stability here on the Korean Peninsula, I have Henri Feron, a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., live on the line. It's been a while, Henri.
Hello, I'm glad to be back. Thank you for having me.
Right. Henri, let's study some possible scenarios. If Mr. Trump is re-elected, do you believe that Washington will swiftly resume dialogue with Pyongyang?
A re-elected Trump could indeed quickly resume negotiations. He stated last August that his intention was to make a deal with North Korea, quote, very quickly. If elected. And I take this possibility seriously. He already invested a lot of political capital in meeting with Kim Jong-un, even though he faced tremendous pressure at home not to. And he also showed that he can pull through certain fundamental shifts, for instance, with his Afghanistan peace deal and his brokering of Arab normalizations with Israel. And North Korea has also left its door open to a deal with Trump. They have refrained in the past 2 years from personal critiques of Trump and from conducting nuclear and long-range missile tests. However, given what happened in Hanoi, I don't expect North Korea to change its red lines significantly. They have their backs to the wall in a way and are unlikely to compromise on nuclear weapons without some form of prior security guarantee. So I think that what will be key is to what extent Trump would cooperate with South Korea to find a way to address these security concerns, for instance, by recognizing an end to the Korean War. As for the top-down approach of using summits for diplomacy, I think it will continue to be relevant. Working-level diplomacy, as was mentioned before, is good for handling technically complex negotiations. The problem here is that we're still at a stage where the United States and the two Koreas need to agree on the fundamental direction of negotiations, whether they want to emphasize peace or whether they want to emphasize denuclearization. And summits create a dynamic of level decision-making that may be better to these problems, especially when dealing with a top-down system like North Korea.
I see. Henry, what are the prospects of Washington-Pyongyang ties if Mr. Biden is elected? Now, he has pledged to engage in principled diplomacy in seeking a nuclear-free peninsula. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Biden has chosen since last year to, how could I say, to personally attack Kim Jong-un. And North Korea state media has responded with insults to Biden as well. So the willingness of both sides to burn bridges in this way suggests to me that Biden administration would have a rocky relationship with North Korea. Some might dismiss Biden's remarks as election talk, but one factor in the equation here, of course, is that the deep tensions that already existed at the time of the Obama administration when Biden was vice president may resurface. It's good to remember, for instance, that North Korea conducted 4 of its 6 nuclear tests during the Obama era. Now, looking at Biden's statement on North Korea policy, those might also be read in Biden's emphasis on principled diplomacy will probably mean something closer to the strategic patience of the Obama era, rather than to the more active engagement of the Trump administration. After all, most of Biden's foreign policy advisors are faces that we know from the Obama. And ultimately, yeah, there is a bit of worry about how this could impact U.S.-North Korea relations in that context.
Right. Henri, in an op-ed for a Korean media outlet just days before the election, Mr. Biden took issue with what he called a failed leadership in the U.S. amid the pandemic, and that has tanked the economy there and shattered hope for Korean Americans. How do you envision Seoul-Washington ties under a Biden administration, especially in matters regarding defense cost sharing and so forth?
Yes, this was an interesting op-ed, a very unusual step, unprecedented step. And what we can note in that op-ed is that it was mostly addressing Korean Americans more than Korea itself. However, he did make clear to distance himself from Trump's approach, especially by emphasizing that he would strengthen the alliance and that he would not press on costs or withdrawal in a way that extortionist to Seoul. So in many ways, Biden has presented himself as promising a return to the pre-Trump era in terms of alliance. That said, the world has also changed, of course, since that time, since the Obama era. And there will be 2 challenges in particular that I think will be critical to whether he can live up to that promise and one of them is that inter-Korean relations have now a completely different dynamic than 10 years ago. South Korea is now pursuing engagement with North Korea. And given how Biden has criticized Trump's engagements with North Korea, especially the summits, etc., might wonder, well, what does he think of the Moon Jae-in administration then? And will there be friction in this context? Another point that will be that may lead also to some tension is that relations between the U.S. and China are worsening, and it's a bipartisan trend in the U.S. now. And that leaves South Korea, of course, in a difficult position because the U.S. is its main military and China is its main trade partner. And the extent to Biden administration could maintain the alliance at the levels that it was before, with Seoul's cooperation, of course, would depend on the extent to which the allies find a way to manage these new tensions. And the alliance remains popular in both countries, and so it is possible to find something that will allow to resolve these dilemmas.
Right. All right, Henri, as always, thank you for making the time to join us live with your thoughts.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Right, and for our viewers here, we do apologize for the slight disruption in connection there. Dr. Ko, we are already aware of the Trump administration's policy on North Korea. So I ask you about the possible policy that would be adopted by the Biden administration. And how do you see Pyongyang responding to Washington under an administration led by Mr. Biden, if he wins, that is?
Well, I think Henri described really well what could the shape of the possible Biden policy towards North Korea. Pretty much a repeat of what we have seen in Obama administration, the policy of strategic patience. So the idea of principle of foreign policy actually it's problematic when it comes to North Korea, because what North Korea wants, first and foremost, is attention from the United States, attention and focus on negotiating with it in terms of denuclearization and so forth. So, but then on the other hand, what we have seen during the Obama era is that the United States government has other important priorities besides North Korea, and they believe that the North Korea is not a trustworthy counterpart to any meaningful negotiations. So this gap in position is probably going to lead to friction and create tension in the Korean Peninsula. So President Trump's approach towards North Korea, emphasizing personal relationship with a dictator, has been problematic and then didn't really lead to concrete results. But then we have to give credit to President Trump, at least in the sense that he's been able to keep North Korea calm in the last 2 years. So, I mean, the best approach would be, the best of the world would be for two approaches: the Obama approach of having principle, or Biden approach of emphasizing principle over expedience, and then also the President Trump's approach of paying attention to North Korea to result in something, a synthesis of the two approaches and leading to something more effective. But then we'll have to see whether, if President Biden gets elected, whether he's going to have a different approach to North Korea.
Dr. Ko, this may be a tough question, but how should Korea or Seoul, the government here, prepare for changes that may or may not occur in Washington, D.C. after the results of the race today?
So regardless of who turns out to be the winner of today's election, I think the South Korean government probably understands by now that it's in the best interest of the country to remain in close steps with the United States, the most important ally. There could be differences in opinions and perspectives, and especially when it comes to North Korea. North Korea is perceived to be a domestic issue for South Korea, but then it's an important international issue. I think South Korean government should understand there's a little bit of difference in perspective between South Korea and the international perspective in this case. So I think it will be a South Korean government's job to make sure that we minimize this gap in perception when it comes to North Korea, and then essentially try to have a unified approach to North Korea, no matter who occupies the White House.
Right. Dr. Tan, despite the difference in stance with regard to issues here on the peninsula by the two presidential nominees, they also advocate different approaches to dealing with the pandemic in the U.S. Would you like to take this moment to tell us a bit about their different approaches?
I think with the Trump administration, it has been both policy but also political, and that has been problematic. However, with the Biden administration, they have said that they are going to use a science, data-driven approach towards COVID-19, and that they will be listening to health authorities, public health authorities, to doctors, to scientists. And in my opinion, that is the right approach. And so we will see what happens after the election.
Right. And staying with that, Dr. Ko, Mr. Trump has hinted that he may fire Dr. Anthony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, if he wins the presidential race. Now, these intentions were shared during a rally in Florida Sunday night, where his supporters, of course, chanted, "Fire Fauci." Do you believe his words were perhaps politically motivated?
Clearly. I think, as Dr. Tan has said, President Trump has shown this tendency to politicize a scientific issue, which is the pandemic, and clearly doesn't like the advice given by Dr. Fauci, because he undermines his case that his political case that the economy has improved under his watch, and because of the lockdown is leading to serious economic challenges for the American people. But I think President Trump attacking Dr. Fauci is a classic case of attacking the messenger because someone doesn't like the message. Regardless of whether President Trump fires Dr. Fauci or not, the COVID-19 will be there. You cannot just ignore it, stick your head in the sand and ignore it, and then hopefully it goes away. It's not going to happen. And I think President Trump might gain some political points by firing Dr. Fauci, but the challenge will remain and it's going to haunt him, I would say.
Right. And Dr. Tan, what are your thoughts on Mr. Trump's intentions to fire Dr. Fauci, who has advised, I believe, 6 presidents in his almost a 40-year tenure? What are your thoughts?
Right, 6 presidents. He's served as the head of the National Institutes of Allergic Diseases and Infectious Diseases at the NIH since 1984. He's well respected. He has devoted his entire professional life to protect, the public health of not just America, but really the world. And so threatening to fire Dr. Fauci, it really doesn't make sense. It's akin to pulling out of the WHO in the middle of a pandemic. It doesn't make sense, and it could really only make the situation worse, not better in terms of COVID-19 control.
Right. What is, Dr. Fauci has been advocating a few policies, of course, the wearing of masks as well. Are there any other policies that perhaps go against President Trump's idea of dealing with the pandemic?
He has said repeatedly that congregate gatherings, so mass gatherings, are one of the most important things that we need to limit, and most likely limit by mandate. That translates to plain talk, stop holding these big, massive political rallies. And the Trump administration, they will not have the advantage they had in the first term. Since day one of being in office, he announced himself as a political candidate. So every gathering was seen as a campaign rally. And so he could gather as many people as he wanted. However, this time, of course, if he were to be elected again, that's not possible. But still, we would need to limit the number of mass gatherings. And then all of the other infectious disease prevention and control measures that we here in Korea are very familiar with in terms of avoiding crowds, physical distancing, proper and frequent hand hygiene, and then rapid testing, appropriate isolation management. And then the second level of policies involve proper vaccine planning, because that task of vaccinating millions, billions of people is going to be a huge logistical task. And then, of course, making treatments available and affordable for people who need them once they are proven safe and effective. So, this has been his message pretty much all along. And here in Korea, they sound very familiar, I'm sure. And that's the way that, that's really the only way that COVID-19 will be controlled.
Right, in the absence of a vaccine and treatment, of course. Dr. Ko, what impact did Mr. Trump's diagnosis of and prompt recovery from COVID-19 have on voter sentiment, do you think?
Well, I think he has probably brought to the, injected some dosage of reality to the ongoing saga, so to speak, of the COVID-19 pandemic. He personified the world. I think it came very personal to many voters that the leader of the country, the most powerful country in the world, could be affected by COVID. And I think that could have resulted in, I would say, a wake-up call for many voters that the government of the United States should take a much more scientific approach towards handling the disease rather than politicizing it. But then, unfortunately, I think President Trump tried to, actually drew an opposite message from his experience of close call with the COVID-19. Unlike some other leaders in the world, especially I would say like Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom, whose infection with COVID-19 essentially changed his mind about COVID-19 and the pandemic control in a good way. President Trump essentially minimized even more the impact of the disease. He said that COVID-19 is something that everybody could overcome, and that he felt even stronger after recovering from COVID-19. And then he ignored the fact that, or actually dismissed the fact that being the president of the United States, he was given a very special treatment, such as experimental drugs and very close attention by the top doctors of the country. So, but for some reason, American voters have found that to be believable. And I think it's because because American people, because of the economic system that doesn't really provide social safety net, they need economic activities to hum along all the time, whether there's a pandemic or not. I think that's forced the American public's perception that, they try to believe that COVID-19 is not a big deal. They try to minimize the impact of it. And I think that's led to the worsening of the situation. But then, it's a very toxic environment, but the president's message, even though it sounds very unscientific and politicized to our ears, has found a very significant audience, clearly. So I think that's something that it's a challenge for the American society as a whole, and especially for the political class, to convince the American public that there are better options out there.
Right. Dr. Dan, perhaps a brief response to this very difficult question. Regardless of who wins the race, what are some of the tasks that lie ahead for the new administration in dealing with COVID-19 in the U.S.?
I think first and foremost, the most important thing is to have truthful, timely, consistent, and uniform messaging. The messaging needs to be coming from all levels of the government. And of course, leading by example is much more powerful than just using your words alone. And I think that is the most important thing. The right message, of course, is that COVID-19 is serious, but it is controllable if everyone follows the recommended infectious disease prevention and control measures that have been highlighted again and again, not just by the WHO, but also the American CDC, and here in Korea, the Korean KCDCA. So that's, I think, the most urgent need is the messaging. Of course, on top of that, we need mandates for mask wearing, for limiting mass gatherings. They need infrastructure and personnel for testing and tracing, all of the epidemic investigation that needs to go on. There's still a lot of delays in that. Supplying PPE for healthcare workers, unbelievably, 10 months in, there are still delays and problems in getting PPE to healthcare workers. And then at some point, they're going to have to consider what to do about border control because it's pretty much a wide open border in the United States.
Right. All right, Dr. Dan, as always, thank you for your thoughts. And Dr. Go, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Right, and on that note, we end our coverage for today. Join us tomorrow as we assess the results of the U.S. presidential race amid the pandemic and more. In the meantime, do take care and thank you for watching.
Korea's COVID-19